In Dragon Valley, every dragon learned to breathe fire before they learned to fly. It was simply the way things were done. On the first morning of a young dragon's life, the elder dragons would gather in the great stone circle at the center of the valley, and one by one the hatchlings would step forward and breathe, and a bright tongue of flame would shoot out, orange and gold and crackling, and the elders would nod, and that was that. You were a dragon. It was official. Flicker had been waiting for his turn for as long as he could remember. He was a small dragon, the smallest in the valley by quite a lot, with scales the color of a winter sky, pale blue fading to silver at the edges. His wings were slightly too big for his body, which made him look like he was always about to tip over, and his eyes were large and round, and the deep gold color of evening light. He was, by every measure except one, a perfectly fine dragon. The one exception was the fire. On the morning of his first breath test, Flicker stepped into the stone circle in front of all the elder dragons and all the other hatchlings and took the deepest breath he had ever taken in his small life. He held it. He felt the warmth building in his chest. He leaned forward and opened his mouth and breathed out with everything he had. Bubbles came out, dozens of them, round, iridescent, catching the morning light and turning it into tiny rainbows, pink and blue and green and gold, floating upward in a slow, beautiful cloud before popping softly one by one in the cold morning air. The stone circle went completely silent. Then Crag laughed. Crag was the largest of the hatchlings, with dark red scales and a laugh like rocks falling down a hillside. He laughed so hard he accidentally breathed fire sideways and singed the tail of the elder dragon standing next to him, which the elder dragon did not appreciate at all. The other hatchlings laughed too. Not all of them. A few stood quietly and looked at their feet, which Flicker noticed and tried to remember. But most of them laughed. The head elder, a very old dragon named Elder Smolder. Do you know what smolder means? It means to burn slowly without a flame, like embers that are still hot even when you cannot see the fire. Elder Smolder did not laugh. He looked at Flicker for a long time with his ancient amber eyes. Then he said, in a voice like distant thunder, that Flicker would practice, and that the fire would come in time. It did not come in time. Weeks passed. Flicker practiced every morning in the far corner of the valley where the other dragons could not see him easily. He tried breathing fast. He tried breathing slow. He tried thinking about things that made him angry, which was mostly Crag, and things that made him excited and things that made him feel warm inside. He tried eating the spicy red berries that grew at the edge of the valley, which gave him a terrible stomach ache and produced slightly larger bubbles, but still very definitely bubbles. His only friend through all of this was a small lavender dragon named Luna. Luna could breathe fire perfectly well, a neat, precise blue flame that she could aim with remarkable accuracy, but she spent most of her time with Flicker anyway, partly because she was kind and partly because she found Crag extremely tiresome. Luna would sit beside Flicker during his practice sessions and watch his bubbles float upward and say things like, "They are quite beautiful, actually," and Flicker would say that beautiful was not the same as useful, and Luna would say, "How do you know?" This became something of an ongoing argument between them. The ice storm arrived on a Tuesday. Nobody had seen one this far south in Dragon Valley in living memory. It came from the North Mountains without warning, a wall of white, moving fast, carrying with it a cold so deep that the river froze solid within an hour and the flowers sealed themselves shut like tiny fists, and the younger dragons, whose fire was not yet strong enough to warm themselves, began to shiver. Do you know what a blizzard is? It is a very severe snowstorm with strong winds and very low temperatures that makes it nearly impossible to see or move, and this was one of the worst in 100 years. The elder dragons did what they always did in emergencies. They breathed fire. They breathed fire at the frozen river to thaw it. They breathed fire at the walls of the stone, shelter to warm it. They breathed fire in great arcs across the valley floor to melt the ice that was spreading across the ground. But the ice storm breathed back harder. Every flame the elder dragons produced, the storm's wind caught and threw sideways. The fire melted some ice, but the wind drove more in behind it faster than they could work. The ice was spreading. The shelter walls were freezing from the inside. The young dragons huddled together in the center, shivering, and the elders' fire was growing smaller as they tired. Crag tried too. His fire was the biggest of the young dragons, a great red gust that he aimed at the ice creeping across the shelter floor. The wind took it. The ice came back. Flicker stood at the edge of the shelter and watched. He watched the way the wind moved, the patterns of it, the gaps in it, the moments when it paused before gusting again. He had spent his whole life watching things he could not do, which had made him very good at watching things carefully. He saw something nobody else had noticed because they were all too busy breathing fire at the problem directly in front of them. The ice was not coming from everywhere. It was coming from one place, a gap in the northern rock wall of the valley, a long, narrow crack that the wind was pouring through like water through a broken dam. If that gap were sealed, just that one gap, the storm would lose its pathway into the valley. The wind would howl outside, but the valley would be protected. The problem was that the gap was high up on the rock face, 40 feet up, maybe more, and it was narrow, too narrow for any of the larger dragons to reach, and it needed to be sealed completely, top to bottom, with no gaps, because even a small space would let the wind back in. Fire could not do this. Fire melted ice, but ice just refreezes. Fire could not fill a gap and stay there. Flicker looked at his bubbles. He thought about what Luna had said. How do you know they are not useful? He took a breath. Then he flew. He was not the strongest flyer. His wings were too big and awkward for precise movement, but he was small, and small was exactly what the gap in the rock face required. He reached it as another gust of ice wind screamed through, nearly knocking him off the rock face entirely. He pressed himself flat against the stone and breathed. Bubbles came out, dozens of them, then hundreds, filling the narrow gap from the inside. And here was the thing about bubbles that fire could never do. Bubbles were flexible. They filled every shape, every corner, every irregular edge of the crack in the rock. They pressed into spaces no flame could reach, and when the freezing air hit them, the bubbles froze, one by one, then all at once they froze into a solid wall of tiny ice spheres, perfectly interlocked, sealing the gap from top to bottom as completely as mortar in a stone wall. The wind stopped, not the storm. The storm still howled outside, but inside the valley, the terrible screaming wind that had been driving the ice through the gap simply stopped. The temperature began to rise. The elder dragon's fire, no longer fighting the wind, began to work properly. The river started to thaw. The ice on the shelter floor retreated. The young dragon stopped shivering. Flicker clung to the rock face 40 feet up, breathing hard, surrounded by his frozen bubble wall, and looked down at the valley below. Everyone was looking up at him. Crag, the elder dragons, Luna, who had her wings pressed together the way she did when she was trying not to cry from relief. Elder Smolder, ancient and still, looking up with those amber eyes. Flicker climbed down slowly because his legs were shaking too much to fly. When he reached the valley floor, nobody laughed. Crag opened his mouth and then closed it again, which was possibly the most unusual thing Flicker had ever seen Crag do. Luna crashed into him with both wings and held on. Elder Smolder walked to Flicker and looked at him for a long time, the way he had on the first morning in the stone circle. He said, slowly, that in 100 years of dragon history, no fire had ever sealed that gap. The valley had been vulnerable to that crack in the northern wall for as long as anyone could remember, and no one had found a way to fix it because everyone had been trying to fix it with fire. He said that a dragon was not only what it breathed, a dragon was what it did with what it had. He said, and this he said in the voice he used for important things, that Flicker's bubbles had just saved every dragon in the valley, and that he thought it was time they stopped calling them a problem. Flicker stood in the snow with Luna's wings still around him and his big 2 large wings folded and his pale blue scales catching the light of the elder dragon's fire, and he thought about what it meant to be useful. Not in the way he had always imagined. Not fire, not roaring, not the thing everyone else could do. Useful in his own particular, specific, irreplaceable way. Crag cleared his throat. He said, with enormous difficulty, that the bubbles had been... He paused a very long time. He said they had been quite good, actually. Luna said he was welcome for the several years of watching Flicker practice. Crag said she had not done anything. Luna said she had provided moral support. This argument continued for quite some time, and Flicker let it wash over him like warm air. That evening, Flicker sat at the edge of the valley and breathed bubbles into the winter sky. They caught the last light, pink and blue and green and gold, and rose slowly upward, each one a tiny, perfect sphere. He still could not breathe fire. He had made peace with this, in the way you make peace with a thing when you discover it was never actually the point. The bubbles were enough. The bubbles were, as it turned out, exactly right.